In this lecture, we'll be unwrapping the body of the plane so we can place a Spitfire texture onto it. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. So I'll select the body of my plane and go into edit mode. Now in order to edit UVs, it's nice to be in the UV editing workspace. So I'll jump across to there, zoom in on that space and zoom in on my aeroplane. Now it can be a bit daunting unwrapping complex objects, but as always, we take the main object and we break it down into separate pieces. In this case, the main wings, the tail wing and the body can be 3 separate islands. Now it's worth also mentioning that we have a mirror, and when you unwrap with the mirror modifier, the exact same thing is happening on the other side. So if I do any marking of seams or anything like that, that will be copied to the other side. Also, when I unwrap, this side's UVs will be in exactly the same position as the mirrored side. Just bear that in mind. It may not make complete sense, but I'll show you what I mean in a moment. So let's come around to the side here and think about where we need the seams to go. So I'm in edge mode at the moment, and I'm going to select the edges between my wing and the body of the plane. Then I can press Ctrl E, mark seams. Now we can unwrap parts of the model separately, so I can press L over the wing, and that selects the linked by the seams. So if I just open up this dialog box here, you can see that seams is selected. So it's selecting this island, as it were, that's broken off from the main body by this seam. With all that selected, I can press U to unwrap and just unwrap the wing. Now it's not working because it's as if someone has squashed it from here and flattened it out. So we need another seam to break this in half. So I'll select the edges coming around the bottom here, and again Ctrl E, mark seams. Remember, you can right click and mark seams as well. Now when I press L, it will only select the bottom. I need to select the top part of the wing as well, so press L again, and that adds to my selection. So the whole wing is now selected. U to unwrap, and we can see the top half of my wing here and the bottom half there. Also remember that this wing is being unwrapped as well, and it's in exactly the same position. So any texture I add here will look exactly the same on the other side. Again, you'll see that in detail later on. So pause the video here and catch up with me and unwrap the main wing. Remember to mark the seams around where it connects to the body and separate the top from the bottom. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now I want to give you a small challenge of unwrapping the back tail wing. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so if I select a part of it and press period key on my numpad, I can zoom in on that area, and now I can select these edges going around here, right click, mark seams, and let's separate the top from the bottom by selecting these around here. Now it's worth mentioning that I pressed Alt left click to select this edge loop, but it also goes across here, and we don't need these selected here or here, so I'll deselect those, and this time right click, mark seams. So I've separated those out. I can now deselect all with Alt A, L to select the top, and L to select the bottom as well, and U to unwrap. And there they are, unwrapped there. So we know that's working well. So let's zoom out and think about the body. Now it may be that we can unwrap the whole of the body as one. So Alt A to deselect all, L to select the body, U to unwrap, and unwrap. And that looks fairly decent. If we take a look at something like the front here, we can see it sort of goes around the corner, but it's squashed it out reasonably well. So that's quite successful. Let's select all now and see how it's unwrapped. Looks a bit strange because it's all on top of each other, but we can easily, with it all selected, do another unwrap, so U to unwrap, and it's placed them into position. But I have got an error message down the bottom here saying object has non-uniform scale, so I must have scaled my object at some point, so it'd be a good idea to go back into object mode, Ctrl A, set my scale, back into edit mode, and unwrap once again. Very slight difference there, but it's always worth doing that so you get a better unwrap. Okay, so pause the video and catch up with me and select all your plane and unwrap it. You should end up with something similar to what I've got here. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now, if for any reason you didn't end up with the same as I have here, let's say, for example, that this particular edge here, if I press Ctrl E and clear seam and then select all and unwrap, you can see that it's tried to add the wing, which is actually this tiny section here, to the whole of the body, and it's gone completely wrong. So I'll undo those steps and select all, making sure I'm back to here. So if for any reason you don't see what I see here, just go around checking that you haven't left any spaces. Okay, at this point, I don't want you to follow along with me, but I'm just going to show you what happens if I go to our mirror modifier and apply my mirror. I will have to be in object mode for that, so tab into object mode and apply the mirror. Then back into edit mode, make sure everything's selected and unwrap. Now first of all, the unwrap has gone wrong, but you can see I've got double the amount of wings, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and tail wings 1, 2, 3, 4, and I haven't got a seam down the middle, so if I Alt left click to select that middle edge loop there and Control E mark seams, then select all, U to unwrap and unwrap, now we can see double the middle body of the plane as well. So I'll undo those steps, and I've got my mirror modifier back into edit mode, and I've got only half, but the UVs are right on top of each other. Now when texturing, I'm happy for the wings to be exactly the same on this side as this side, and of course the tail wing as well, but the main body, we don't want it to have the same this side as this side, because the graphic we're going to be using, or the texture we're going to be using, has some writing on it, and if it's mirrored to the other side, the writing will be the wrong way round. So I do want to apply my mirror so the two halves can be placed onto my texture in different places. So I'll go back to object mode and apply my mirror. Back into edit mode, you can see my UVs are still there, so it's all still unwrapped and the two halves are on top of each other. So if I select islands, for example, select this wing and press G to grab, you can see the other one is there. I'll undo that change though. So I have to create a loop cut down the middle, so Alt left click to select that loop going all the way through and right click, mark seams. Now I can press L over the middle and L on the other side as well, and U to unwrap and unwrap. Now I've got two body sections. Let's select all. So here are my two body sections and they're separate, but I've still got my wings that are right on top of each other. So again, G to grab, and you can see the other one underneath there. And I can therefore box select both of these so they're both selected and move them together. So I can create space and move them into the right position later on. And I always want to keep these together. They're going to be exactly the same from one side to the other. The same for the tail wings. There's two there, and I can box select them and move them together, or I can just select one, G to grab, and you can see it's on top of the other. Now, just as a quick reminder, if I select all with A and press U to unwrap and unwrap, my wings now are not right on top of each other, and it's actually fairly awkward for me to position them so that they are. So I'm going to undo that. That's why I wanted to unwrap the body separately into two sections, so it didn't disrupt my other UV islands being right on top of each other from when we unwrapped when it had a mirror. Hopefully that all makes sense, but just pause the video here and catch up with me applying the mirror and marking that seam down the middle, but making sure that you only unwrap the body of the plane. So select the body of the plane using L and only unwrap that section. That means the wings will keep their position, each wing being right on top of each other. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be texturing the wings, moving our UVs into position over our texture. So here's where we got up to last time. And as I've done previously, I'm going to come up to the top corner here and bring down a new window for the shader editor. So across to the left-hand side and change it to the shader editor. I'll press N to get rid of the side panel, and let's zoom in on our material. Now in the resources that come with the lecture, we've got a Spitfire texture, so I can click and drag that into my shader editor. When I do that, the texture comes into our UV editor. That's not always the case, so you may have to just select it from the drop-down menu here. So we've got a Spitfire texture, and you can see that I've reversed the text on one side. Hence why if I select all my model, we've got two sides to the main body of the plane. Just a quick note on the texture, I've got this from Wikimedia Commons, and I've adapted it from this photo here. So a special thanks to Alan Wilson for taking a great photo and allowing people to use it. So back into Blender, I can now hook my texture up, and I'll rename the material plane. And let's go across the menu at the top and into material preview mode. And we can see the plane texture. Looks almost random the way it's spread out on our object, but notice the wings are exactly the same on both sides. The same at the back, but they're just in the sky at the moment, as you can see there. And that's because we unwrapped whilst our mirror modifier was on. Whereas the main body, we applied the mirror modifier and then unwrapped it, so we have two separate UV islands for them. So pause the video here and catch up with me, bringing in your Spitfire texture and hooking it up to the principled BSDF, and move into material preview mode so you can see that texture on your plane. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, let's take a closer look at the texture. If I press Control Spacebar, that will go into full screen mode and zoom in a touch. Now we can see we haven't got any wings on our texture. Now you could find a copyright-free image of a Spitfire's wing and add it to this texture, maybe in a space such as here. But I want to show you that it's not always necessary. It depends on the complexity of your model and how detailed you want to go. So I'll press Ctrl Spacebar to come out of full screen mode. And we'll start with the tail wings at the back. So that it's nice and easy to view, I'm going to press Alt-A to deselect all and L to select linked. And remember that's by seam, so we're selecting that area there. Do make sure that you select the other side as well. So L on the other side, we'll select that as well. Now I've got my two islands on top of each other here. I'll select one of those, G to grab, and you can see when I move that around, I can move it onto my plane and we get the texture from the plane. I'll undo that because we want to select both of those islands at the same time and then G to grab and move it onto my plane. Now you can see it's fairly effective choosing a random position on my plane here. So we could try having a little bit of text in there, for example. It's a little bit more tricky if I try and get the target in. It sort of warps slightly, but it's possible. Maybe something towards the front of the plane. We've got this sort of strange yellow line here, which is coming across here. So a position around these numbers, somewhere around here. It's not great, but it works reasonably well. Notice how I've got part of the texture in the sky just there, and that looks to be the front just here. So we can see a tiny bit of sky, and it's stretched a little bit there. It's not too bad, but it's not great. You may want to scale it down and move it into position where you've got no text and no sky, maybe somewhere around here, and see how that looks. It's not too bad, but my paneling, because I've rotated it, is off at a funny angle, so maybe rotating it isn't the best idea. Maybe going in line like this is better. So it's working reasonably well just by placing it onto a random position like this. Ideally, you'd have a texture that has a tail wing in it and a main wing as well. So I want you to have a go now at moving the UVs of the back tail wing. You can rotate it and scale it, but try and find a position where the texture kind of fits. It's probably best not to have any text on it, as that can distort slightly, and it doesn't mirror very well to the other side. So pause the video and have a go at that. Now it can get a bit tougher when we come to the main wing. If I come out a bit and move across to the wing, so Alt-A to deselect all, and then L to select the top two here. And let's find those, there they are. And like I say, this is a bit tougher for the main wings because they're much bigger. So now when I try and scale these down and move them into position, if I scale them down very small and move them into a position of that texture, of those panels there, it's not too bad, but we do start seeing a little bit of graininess as the texture becomes more pixelated. But I think that's relatively nice. Probably around here we can get away with, and it looks fairly decent. So that's that position in there. It's a little bit distorted around the front here, which is probably this area just here. And maybe I can come in, go across to vertex mode selection and select just that area there and move it into a new position. Getting a lot of stretch now, so I'd probably have to move these two down as well. Remember, I can't just click once because that will move just one side. I have to box select to move those into position. So we're getting a bit of stretch there, which you can see a bit clearer in object mode. Back to edit mode now though. As those textures become close together, we could box select those next two and maybe edge slide them down to reduce that stretch. These ones too, but watch what happens to my texture, and particularly this graphic here. As I move that down, that also becomes stretched as we change the size of this face here. So a little bit of movement there, so the edge here doesn't become too stretched, but if I go much further, you can see that graphic being stretched there. So probably somewhere around about here. And that looks relatively good. A little bit of a line across there of white, but I think we're okay. So a fairly successful position just there. So pause the video here, catch up with me and position the UVs of the top of your wings. Okay, so we've got the underside of the wings to do. Now, depending on the use of this may not be as important as the top. You may not see the underside of the plane as much, but we've got to try and find a position for both of those. So remember to deselect all and select both of those with L. And a small challenge to you is to position the UVs of the underside of the main wings and the tail wings. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll zoom out to find those. Now, hopefully you remembered you need to go back into island mode if you want to select them as one big island. You can do this in vertex mode and just select the whole lot, of course. It's just a little bit easier in island mode. and we can rotate those, scale them down a touch, and try and move them into a useful position. We can have it similar to the other one, so somewhere around about here. You can scale this as well if you want to try and make it longer and thinner, but of course that does stretch the textures slightly as well. So you can see if I come over the text there, it's slightly stretched. So a bit of experimentation. I'll scale that back in the Y there. Somewhere around here looks quite interesting. Let's just go into object mode and see what that looks like. A little bit stretched, but I can go to the vertices and try and change them slightly there. Just a touch to line that up a bit more. And it's kind of working okay. Of course, any text I use is going to have some mirror writing on one side, so maybe going over text isn't the best idea. So let's select them all again and go over the graphic like we did before. Rotate that into some sort of position around here, and that looks fairly good. Let's zoom in a bit and again into vertex mode, and let's move that down slightly. Move this one down very slightly so that very end there hasn't got those distinguishing marks. Back into object mode to see what that looks like. That's not too bad. Okay, and the back, into edit mode again, deselect all, L on both those back faces there. Back to island mode and select both of those. G to grab, scale it down slightly and move it into position. Perhaps somewhere around here. Just double check that that's okay. And that looks alright. There's a little bit of writing there, but you can't really notice it. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. In the next video, we'll be texturing the body, and I'll show you some different techniques. But of course, do make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be using a different unwrapping technique to texture the body of the plane. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. We've unwrapped the wings, but we still need to work on the body on both sides. So if I go back into edit mode, I've still got the underneath of the tail wings selected. So I'll press Alt A to deselect all first, and then press L over my plane. Now occasionally, even though I've got seam selected here, it hasn't worked. So I'm just going to press Alt A and L again. And that's a slight bug. It's just not registering that seams is selected. So you just deselect all and select again, making sure that seams is selected, and that should work fine. So we can see the side of my plane body there. And I'm in island selection mode, so I can select it all. And don't follow along with me, but I'm just showing you what you could do. I'll zoom in a bit, rotate 90 degrees, scale in the X, so it's about the size of the plane. I'll have to scale it in the Y as well, so it squashes down a little bit, rotate it, and try and move it into position. Do note that if I rotate it slightly and then scale in the X again, it is going to distort slightly when you scale, so it's always best to bring it back to where it was level, then scale in the X to bring it in if you need to. Then do the rotation once again. So it's not quite fitting my graphic. Let's see what we've got on our plane. It's not looking too bad, but we've got all this area up here that's in the sky, as you can see there. We've got a funny image of the pilot's head there. So I would now have to go in. So perhaps go to vertex selection mode, select these, perhaps put proportional edit on and start moving them around. So select a few and kind of sculpt them into position, as you can see me doing here. The problem is, let's have a look at the back graphic there. It's all distorted and stretched, and it will take me a while to try and sort that out and make it level again. And you can see I'm finding it fairly difficult. I'll just go to object mode so you can see that, and back into edit mode. So anywhere where there's text or a detailed graphic which you want to preserve, it's quite tough to try and position these so it doesn't distort. As you can see, quite severely distorted there. I could continue and try and move these into a position where there's less distortion, and maybe something like this if you were trying to do it nice and quick and your models were only going to be seen from a distance from around here, then that might be acceptable. However, there's a better way to unwrap the sides like this. I'll go back into edit mode and just double check that I've just got that side selected, so Alt A and L, so I've definitely only got that side selected there. If I go into side view now and press U to unwrap to go to my unwrap menu, there's an option here, project from view. So when I select that, you can see my UVs here and they look exactly the same as the layout in side view. I can zoom in so you can see that a bit clearer. Now that means that these faces at the front here, so if I go to face mode, select those faces there, and I've actually got an extra one selected, but I'll keep that selected for now because that's helpful. You can see the one that's on the side is nice and clear as a rectangle, but the ones that are in line, when I go to side view, you can see they're in line. They have been squashed flat in my UVs. Now that's absolutely okay because we're not really going to see this front area here because it's hidden by the propeller, but that's just worth bearing in mind. So I'll press Alt A and just select the side view again. Now I can come in to my UV image editor, scale this up. I'll just turn proportional edit off so it doesn't confuse at all, and scale it up so it's about the size of the plane. Let's bring it down slightly. Probably going to have to scale in the Y a touch as well. Rotate it round until it's roughly matching up with my image texture. So let's go to object mode and see what we've got. Now my graphics are lining up reasonably well and it's looking quite good. So pause the video here, select the left hand side of the body of the plane, go to side view, U to go to the unwrap menu and project from view. Then move that big island that you've created over the texture of the plane. Pause the video and have a go at that. So there's a slight problem with the top here where we can see the sky. So we could go in vertex mode and perhaps select this end vertex here and G to pull that down. If I move this one down by pressing G, you can see that it distorts my circle there. So that's a little bit more tricky. If I bring the one below it up, I can kind of mitigate some of that distortion, but it is still getting slightly distorted. So we can have a slightly squashed circle there, which isn't too bad. Or if I undid those steps, we could show a little bit of sky on our texture, which again, in this case, isn't actually too bad. I think it's slightly better with a slightly distorted circle, but that's entirely up to you for what you'd prefer from your texture. There may be some other places, such as the bottom here, where we're seeing a bit of grass. So let's just have a quick look at that. And that we can easily tidy up. We can select these two here, maybe these ones as well, just so there's not too much stretch. Bring those up slightly, and then these up slightly as well, and these up slightly. And that's looking a lot better already. Now our graphic is going off the side slightly. It's quite tricky to sort that out. I could possibly move these across, but you can see as soon as I start trying to change it, we get a bit of wobble in our texture there. And I'd have to select these ones, maybe move those across a bit to line it up, but it starts getting quite awkward and difficult. So generally speaking, it's not looking too bad. Let's have a look at some of the front elements, and our sort of exhaust areas here are looking quite good, and that's looking quite reasonable, I would say. So the project from view method is fairly successful. So I want you to pause the video here and catch up with me, making any minor edits you think you need to make to your texture so it lines up nicely and looks good on our model. So what about the other side? I'll press Alt A to deselect all, and then L to select just this side. Come to left view, so Control 3. We've got left view there, U to unwrap and project from view. Now I can select all, or I can go to island mode and select all. Now of course this is facing the wrong way, so I'm going to have to flip it. So I can scale X -1 to flip it round, and now I can scale it up and move it into position. And I'll speed this footage up slightly. Let's just take a quick look. It's not looking too bad. Even on the top it's not looking awful, it's a little bit confused up here. But from a distance, I think it's looking quite nice. We could of course go in and try and edit some of these areas. Maybe if I go to vertex mode, just bring this one down slightly. So it's a little bit less obscure up the top there. And this one down slightly as well. Somewhere around there seems to work reasonably well. And we've successfully unwrapped our plane. So pause the video here and catch up with me doing exactly the same on the other side, and make any minor adjustments that you think you need to make the texture work with the model. Okay, just as a quick challenge to you, I want you to see if you can add materials for the propeller and the cockpit. I added a new material for the middle part of the propeller and a separate material for the propeller blades. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll start with the propeller blades. Select one of those, new material, zoom in on my Principled BSDF, and I chose a color close to black for those. Of course, when I change one, they all update. Let's select the main body now, new material once again, and I'll change this to a sort of silvery color somewhere around here. And I'll scroll down a bit with the Principled BSDF and turn the metallic all the way up. So it's this sort of metallic color. And you might want a slightly lighter or slightly darker metal, that's entirely up to you. For the cockpit, if I select that, choose a new material, I chose a base color, which is a very sort of light grey, maybe a little bit of blue as it's reflected from the sky, and I turn the roughness right down. So it's got a sort of reflective quality like this. Lastly, it's all very flat shaded at the moment, so let's select everything, right click and shade smooth. And just so we can see the final result easier, if I turn my gizmos off and my overlays off, we can see it without any distractions and it looks really nice. So hopefully you got an okay with that. As always, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And before doing anything, I just want to bring back my gizmos so you can see my Cartesian coordinates up the top there, and bring back my overlays so you can see what I've selected and my grid floor and so on. Now, before preparing the plane for animation, I just want to select the cockpit. I'll just press Shift right click to move the 3D cursor so we can see that easily. And I don't feel it's dark enough, so I'm just going to change the color so it's darker, and I think that looks a lot better. Also, one other thing that I wanted to point out is that if I select a propeller and just zoom in on that, if I go to edit mode now, and let's say try and select a face, we can't really see it. Of course, we could go to X-ray mode like we were before, and then I can see those faces, that's fine. But at this point, it's nice to have X-ray mode off because we're in material preview mode, so we can see our textures a bit easier. Well, in the modifier, so under the spanner and my solidify modifier here, we've currently got our offset to the center. So if I bring that to the back like this, so -1, we can then see our faces, or I could bring it to the front and we can see the faces on the back. But if you have the offset in the middle, so it's coming out of both sides, you can use this button called On Cage. If I press that, it kind of shows you the results of the modifier as if you had applied it. So I can select a face here. It does select all those faces because that one face with the modifier makes up all those other faces. So I can select areas in here if I need to. And if I select this top face, and let's have a quick look at our Spitfire texture once again, the propellers actually have this yellowy color on the tip. So as a challenge to you, I want you to add a yellow color to the tip of the propeller. Now you could do this by unwrapping it and trying to map it to the plane, but the much easier way is with material slots. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you remembered that slots are up the top here, and with my object selected in edit mode, and with that face selected, I can go to the slots, add a new slot, assign that face to it. It immediately turns white because there's no texture in slot 2 yet, so let's add a texture. I'll call this yellow and change the color to a yellowy color. Let's see what that looks like. It's not too bad, but it's not quite matching the yellow here. If I click on the base color and choose the pipette, or the eyedropper as it's known, I can then pick a color from my reference image. And you can see that that's now matching much more closely. Let's go back to object mode and see how that looks. And I think that looks great. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. Now let's think about preparing our plane for animation. Now currently it's lots of separate objects, as you can see there. So when animating, I would need to select all the objects and move them around. It's actually a lot simpler to attach these objects, or parent as we call it, to one single object called an empty. I'll show you what that means. I'll go to side view with 3, just move to the middle, Shift A to add, and there's empty in the middle there. So I'll choose plane axis. It doesn't matter what you choose because they all serve the same function. They just look a bit different in case you needed them to look different so you can identify them. So I use a plane axis. I'll move that into the middle here, and let's go to front view and make sure it's right in the center of my plane. So just there looks good. Incidentally, that's actually right in the middle of the grid. So I may as well press N on my toolbars, go to item and click and drag over all my location and press 0 to make sure that's right in the center like that. I'll press N to get rid of that panel. It helps if it's in the center of your plane, just for the sake of rotation, especially when it comes to front view and you want to rotate or bank the plane. So pause the video here and add an empty and make sure it's roughly in the middle of your plane. Okay, so now I want to parent, so attach these objects to my empty. Before I do that, it would be a good idea to start labeling things. So I'm just going to bring down the outliner, start with the empty, and I'll call that plane controller. And I'll just go through labeling each object. And for the sake of speed, I'll speed the footage up. And I'll put the whole plane into a collection. So M to move to new collection, and plane. That will make a difference when we start bringing other objects into our animation. Now with them all selected, I need my empty to be the active object. Currently, it's the main part of my propeller just at the front there. So I need to shift select my plane controller. So that's now the active object. And then I can go up to the object menu. So at the front of my panel at the top, object, and under parent, I can choose object. So now if I select my controller on its own and press G to grab, it moves all the objects together. I'll right click to cancel that. Also, if I go to the side here and press R then Y, I can also bank my plane like this as well. Now the interesting thing about using a parent system like this is that I can still move the children, so the things that are attached to the parent object, I can still move them independently. So I could still move the propeller over here, for example, and when I go back to the plane controller, I can still move that around. I'll undo those steps. So pause the video here and parent your objects to the empty. The useful thing about parenting like this is I can change the position of any of these objects, but they'll still be affected by our main controller. And in fact, I'm noticing that my propeller is in the middle of this sort of main propeller object at the front, whereas it should be at the back here. So I'll just go to side view, zoom in, and G to grab in the Y, and move those backwards to there. And also this Spitfire has a black at the front, so I'm going to change that to a dark metallic color somewhere around here. I think that looks a bit better. Now the fact that I can move these objects independently means I can also rotate these around the Y, but they'll still move with the main controller. But once again, these are separate objects, so it's a little bit tricky. I have to keep selecting them separately and then deselect the plane and rotate them if I want to animate them or change any of the animation. So we could have a controller for the front of the plane as well. And that's the great thing about this parenting system. I can parent these to a plane controller and then parent the parent controller to the main plane controller. So to position my controller in the right place, let's select this object here and have a quick look. That's right in the center, but it's not quite right in the center of the grid in the Z-axis. You can see the Y is slightly above the middle of my propeller. However, these are nicely positioned in relation to the main body of my propeller, so they'll rotate nicely around that. So if I select that main body there and Shift S to move my cursor to selected, so it's in the middle there, I can now press Shift A to add and add a new empty. Let's choose a different one this time, and maybe we'll choose circle, and I'll scale that down slightly. So our propeller controller is in the right position. Now a quick challenge to you then is to set up the propeller so it's parented to the propeller controller. Pause the video and have a go at that. So I select all these objects and select the propeller controller last, so that new empty that I've created there, and we can go to the object menu and parent, or we can press Ctrl P for the shortcut, and there's object there. So now when I select the controller and press R then Y, I can rotate my propeller around like this. I'll undo that movement and I'll just rename this propeller controller, and I'll move that into the plane collection. So pause the video here and catch up with me, selecting your propeller objects and parenting them to the propeller controller. Now it's worth noting that the plane controller has a drop down arrow and it has the cockpit and the plane body in it, and the propeller controller has a drop down arrow and it's got all the propeller components within it. Now if I move my plane controller, notice that it's only moving the plane and the cockpit now. So you can see this parent relationship here. We've got the plane body. Oh, and I haven't renamed my cockpit. So let's just rename that quickly. So when I added the propeller objects to the propeller controller, it undid the parent to the plane controller. And now they're only attached to the propeller controller. But I want these to move when my main plane controller moves. So I can select this one, the propeller controller, shift select the plane controller and Control P and parent both those. So now we have a situation where I can move the plane controller and it moves everything, but I can use my propeller controller, so R then Y, to control the propellers. A good analogy for this is that you have a mother with a baby inside her. So when the mother moves, the baby moves, but the baby can still move independently of the mum. So if I rotate this in the Y and then move this up, it's like the baby's moved around inside the mum, but it still goes wherever the mother goes. So I'll undo those two. It obviously gets very odd when you think about a baby inside a baby inside a baby, but that is possible with parenting using this method. So pause the video and catch up with me, making sure that your propeller controller is parented to your main plane controller. And once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, I'll give you a brief introduction to animation by animating our plane flying over some buildings. So here's where we got up to last time, and I want to bring in the buildings and the barrels from one of the previous lectures to create a scene for our aeroplane to fly across. So I'll come back to layout mode, so we've got a nice lot of space, and go into material preview mode. I'll zoom out a touch and select my plane controller, G then Z to move that upwards. Then I can bring my building and barrels into here. Now in order to bring in items from one scene to another, we can go up to File and it's under Append. There is an option Link as well. It's slightly more complicated, so for beginners I always suggest Append. There's also import and export options here, and you might think you're importing from a different Blender file, but these are all for different file types of objects. So instead we go to Append, and then I can navigate to the folder with my file in. The file I'm looking for is called Lots of Barrels. So I'll double click on that and I can go to the object. You can also choose a whole collection to bring in a group of items, but I'll go to Object so I can choose specific ones. And what I need is the cube, which is the house, and then the 4 cylinders, which are the barrels. Obviously it would be a better idea to label your items or put these into a collection, especially when it comes to much larger scenes. So if you are creating a big scene, then do make sure you're thinking about some sort of naming conventions. So I'll append those in, and you can see those appear in the middle of our scene there. Okay, so I'm going to quickly add a floor as well. So I'll press Shift S to move my 3D cursor to the world origin, and then Shift A to add, mesh, and then plane, and scale it up so it's nice and big. Also, I'm going to select my building and barrels. I'll deselect the floor and rotate them around the Z-axis 90 degrees. And we'll have the plane flying over our buildings and barrels in this direction. Don't worry too much about this setup. I'll set you a challenge a little bit later on to build a bit more of a scene. But for now, they're just a point of reference so we can have our plane fly over something. So just pause the video and catch up with me, appending your items into this file and putting them onto a floor in a position where our plane can fly over them. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so for animation, I'm going to go to the animation workspace. So I'll click on that and you can see we've got 2 3D viewport windows, one with the camera and one that we can just move around and see our items. We've also got a dope sheet down at the bottom. That's so we can see what's happening with our keyframes. And we've also got a timeline right at the bottom here. If I bring this up, you can see there's a timeline down there. I'll just bring that back down because bring it all the way down to the beginning there, because the timeline has these extra pieces in here, this record button and play buttons, as well as the start and finish time. But the other details of the timeline, the keyframes that are underneath and hidden now, are actually shown in more detail within the dope sheet. That's why you have the timeline squashed down like this. Now we've also got some other useful information under the output properties just here, and you can see our frame start and frame end there, the same as down here on our timeline. We've also got the frame rate, so that's 24 frames per second. So when Blender renders an animation, it will render 24 still images for each second of footage. I find this much easier to change to 25, which is the European standard. It really doesn't make too much difference these days, but 25 is much easier when you're trying to figure out how many seconds and so forth are in your animation. So what I want to do with my animation is take my plane, so I'll take the plane controller, G then Y, move it back across our scene over here, and we're going to have it fly from one side to the other. And we're going to rotate the propeller as well. I'm also going to move the camera so we can easily see the plane flying over the buildings. So I'll press N with my mouse over this viewport, choose View and lock camera to view, and then press N again and move to a position where I can see my buildings somewhere around about here, making sure the plane is off screen and it's going to go off screen the other side as well. So something like this works well. I could also change to material preview mode so I can see my items a bit more clearly, but it's not particularly important. Okay, so pause the video here and set up your camera so it's at the side of your buildings like this, and have the plane off camera to the side like I have here. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so in order to animate going from one side to the other, we need to set what are called keyframes. So I want this to be my starting position. So I bring my playhead, which I can click and drag along here, to 0. And to insert a keyframe at this point, I move my mouse over the 3D viewport and press I to insert. Now we can set keyframes for the location and the rotation. You can also do two at once, so location and rotation is commonly used. I'll choose that so you can see what happens. A yellow dot appears to say that there's a keyframe there. It also appears in the timeline, so I'll show you that. That's the timeline, and it just has the single yellow dot saying there's one keyframe. Again, I'll bring that back down. The dope sheet, however, has a bit more information, so you can see the object transforms and the particular channels, as they're known, that have been animated and have keyframes attached to them. Incidentally, I can move around this by using the wheel of my mouse or middle mouse button to move around as well. I'll minimize this though because we don't really need to see it, and I'll move up so we can see all of those keyframes. Now it looks a little bit complicated at the moment, but just realize that there's one main keyframe for the position and rotation of our aeroplane. So just pause the video here and bring your playhead to frame 0 and insert a keyframe for the location and rotation of your plane controller. Okay, so I want my plane to move across the screen fairly quickly, so I would say possibly 2 seconds. So I want to move my playhead 2 seconds across to place my next keyframe. So just have a quick think about where 2 seconds would be on my timeline. So hopefully you're getting the idea that 25 frames per second means that 1 second will be 25 frames, so to there, and 2 seconds would of course be 50 frames. So at frame 50, I want my plane to be over here. So G then Y, and you can see it going past my camera there. So somewhere around there should work nicely. So I've positioned that, and I can press I to insert the keyframe, location and rotation. Now if I bring my playhead between these two keyframes, you can see it going across the screen like so. So we've got a very simple animation. Now our animation is only 50 frames, so we may as well change the end to 50 frames. And I can zoom in on my 50 frames here. And instead of grabbing your playhead like this, you can press play by pressing spacebar. When it gets to the end, you'll see it repeats the animation, and I can press spacebar to stop. Now I'll just quickly show you how you can delete a keyframe in case you accidentally put one in the wrong place or something like that. You can select the very top, and that will select all the ones underneath, and you can press delete. So if I scrub my timeline across my frames, you can see nothing's happening. So I'll go back to frame 50, G then Y, move it across to about there, and once again I to insert a keyframe in the location and rotation. And there's my animation back. So pause the video and catch up with me, creating a second keyframe at frame 50 and move your plane across to the other side of the scene. Okay, so we're almost there. I'll just select the propeller controller and zoom in on that. And we want to animate this. So I'll press I to insert the keyframe, and we only need the rotation this time. And you can see under my object transforms, we've only got rotation there. Don't worry about the term Euler. It can be a little bit confusing for beginners, but just understand that that is controlling rotation. I'll minimize that. So we've got our keyframe, and I accidentally put it on frame 2. I can easily move that keyframe by clicking and dragging the top and moving it to frame 1. And it'll be helpful actually if I zoomed in a bit so I get this in the right place. So I can click and drag these keyframes along, and that now is at frame 1. Now I can go to frame 50, and I'll press period key on my numpad to zoom in on my propeller again, which is on the other side of my scene. And I'm going to press RY 3600. So I'm going to type in 3600, and you can see that at the very top of my screen there, and press enter. So I've rotated the propeller all the way around 10 times, so 360 degrees is once round. I can now press I and then keyframe the rotation, and you can see the propeller rotating there. So if I zoom out a bit, move across slightly, you can see my propeller rotating. 10 times will be very slow, in fact, so you may want to go 36,000 instead, so it rotates 100 times as it goes across. I'm not particularly sure how many revolutions it would actually do in 2 seconds, but you can look it up if you like. So let's zoom out a bit further, and I can press play to see my plane flying across and the propeller rotating. So pause the video and catch up with me, putting in the 2 keyframes for your propeller's rotation. Now for your final challenge, it would be great to put in an interesting kind of scene here. So maybe duplicate your building a few times, place your barrels into different positions, perhaps even find a texture for a crate as well. So you've got barrels and crates, the classic game objects. And you could even find a different building material and have lots of different buildings in our scene. Now, if you're not completely confident about building this, then do look at the next lecture where I go through in detail about how I made the scene. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, I'll be giving you the challenge of making a scene like this, and I'll be giving you a rundown of how I made it, and we'll be looking at how we can extend our animations nice and easily. So I'll start off by giving you the challenge of making a similar scene to what I've done here. If you don't feel confident, then do look at my run through, which I'll show you in just a moment. But it's worth having a go, see how you get on. You will need to grab a few more textures for buildings from textures.com. So pause the video here and have a go at that. So to start with, I wanted to work on the houses, so I decided to move the origin point to the bottom face so I could scale them up and down nice and easily. So selecting that bottom face, Shift S to get to my cursor menu and cursor to selected. And then right click in object mode, origin to 3D cursor. So now my origin is at the bottom and I can scale them really easily. So I duplicated one building off to the side just to test, and I can scale now in the Z axis nice and easily. Move the barrels to the front so they're not in the way of the extra buildings I'm about to create. And now create lots of new buildings with different heights. Now I need to texture them with different textures, so I selected on a new building and created a new texture based on the old one, so add new material button just there. And as I'm starting to build up more objects in the scene, I decided it would be a good idea to label my original material and the new material. So back to building 2, and I changed the texture to a different texture that I downloaded from textures.com. It's much grayer looking, but it seems to work okay. And I went across to the UV editing workspace and moved the front face UVs to a position that looked like a front of a building. And I thought about changing the side, but I thought that probably won't be seen, so didn't worry too much. Then I linked that with another house with the Control L command, and I'll have about 3 houses or so to repeat over and over. And I used a different part of the texture just to add some variation. So now it's just a case of going through the houses, deciding what textures I want, maybe reshaping them, resizing them, and moving the front face UVs into position. Again, I'm not worried about the side faces because they probably won't be seen much. Here's another texture downloaded from textures.com. I positioned the UVs for the front face, but I think it was quite bad, so I changed it later on. Then I created more houses just by duplicating the same ones over and over, and the same with the barrels just over and over, just for simplicity. And I organized the position a bit more later on. Now the floor is far too white, so I changed it to a grey colour to start off with to see if that would make a difference and work with my scene. And then I thought it would be much nicer to actually get a floor material instead. So I repositioned it to look more like a road. I could have done a pavement here as well. I think that would have been nice, but it would take a little bit longer. And of course I unwrapped it with U and then set up a new material with an image texture at the front plugged into the color. Then found my floor material, made sure that texture was hooked up. It's a bit stretched, so I needed to change the UVs. For this, I took the UVs and scaled them right up so you can see it repeated over and over. And it seems to be a seamless texture, this one, so it's quite nice. So I can't see any repetition. I scaled the floor up a little bit and repositioned my camera to see whether I could cover the scene with it. Obviously I repositioned my camera much more later on anyway. Then I jump across to the shading workspace and to the world tab so I can insert an HDRI into the background. If you press Ctrl T on the world tab, it will bring up the nodes for you and you can then choose your HDRI. I chose the basic outdoor HDRI from Polyhaven, and it was a bit bright the first one, so I changed it to a less bright one. I did turn on the screen space reflections at this point just to see if that would make any difference, but I chose a much less bright HDRI and deleted the light in the scene. And at this point I thought I'd experiment with some camera positions and building positions. So I duplicated all my buildings and put them across the other side and then made a kind of windy street like you'd expect to see in an old town. Then I moved my whole town across so the plane would fly over the top. It's easier to move the town than it is the plane because that's got some animation on it. Then I went across to the animation workspace because it's easier to see where my camera is, and I moved that into a position that I was comfortable with. Checked my animation was roughly working okay and it looks fairly good going across the houses like this, and then moved some of my barrels into position. Of course, if you've got some crates, you can move those into position as well. But hopefully from this you'll get the idea of how you can create the scene that I did here. So I've got my far more interesting scene completed now, but it would be nice if the animation was a tiny bit longer and the plane started further back so it flew right over the houses. So if I come to the start again and select my plane controller, I want to change this keyframe. For that, it's fairly simple. I can just move this back in the Y, so G then Y, move this right back over to here, out of shot, so quite far back there, and I to insert keyframe on the location and rotation. To make my animation longer, I can extend it to maybe 4 seconds, so 100 frames. And my end keyframe here, that's still with the plane controller selected. I can just press G to grab to move that across to frame 100. Now let's see what that looks like. Comes from a distance there, but my propeller stops at frame 50, as you can see there. So I need to change that, but the plane position is correct. So I'll just zoom in a touch and select the plane propeller controller, and you can see my 2 keyframes there. I just need to extend this all the way to the end here. So now when I press play, we should see a plane flying over our scene like this. So your challenge then is to make any changes that you feel are necessary to your scene, experiment with different camera positions and different house positions, and change the length of your animation from 2 seconds to 4 seconds. And once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be looking at lighting and in particular HDRIs and how we can rotate those to make our scenes look even better. And I'll be talking a little bit again about Eevee and cycles. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I've got my camera at the front of the scene there and all my buildings curving around the corner. I'm in the shading workspace, and in order to talk about lighting, I'm going to bring across my side windows here, change this one to the 3D viewport and change it to camera view. I'll zoom in a bit and let's make sure that's on rendered. So we're seeing the final result here, but I've also got my 3D viewport next to it so I can make some decisions on lighting. Down at the bottom here, I've got the shader editor so I can change any materials. However, this is probably more suitable if I change it to the world tab. Then I've got my HDRI in the background so I can change the strength if I need to affect the lighting. So pause the video here and catch up with me and set up your workspace accordingly. Okay, so you can probably see, I'll zoom in a tiny bit more on my camera here. And in fact, let's get rid of the overlays and the gizmos so we can see a bit more of the final result there. Now you can probably see that it's a little bit flat in the sense that there's not a lot of shadows and contrast. And I'm in the render engine Eevee, and that's often a common problem with the shadows cast by our HDRI in the background. Now in the render properties, I can change the ambient occlusion, turn that up a bit to give it a little bit more contrast around places. So a little bit more shading within the crevices. So I've gone up to 1.4, but that does depend on how big your scene is. And it gives it a bit more depth, so that slightly helps. We could come down to the shadows option here and turn it to high bit depth, but you don't really notice a huge amount of difference with that. Now what we can also do is go into our world settings here. So I've got my HDRI plugged in, and just as a quick reminder, I'll unplug that. If I select on my background and press Ctrl T, that's with the node wrangler installed, and I'll press G to grab to move that down, you can see that that gives me 3 nodes. The environment texture, but also a mapping node and a texture coordinate. So I'll just delete those ones and hook up my original once again. And a quick reminder, the HDRI is downloaded from Polyhaven, and it does offer light into our scene. Now the useful thing about the mapping node, which incidentally, if I press Shift A to add, is under Vector, and there's Mapping. I can use this to rotate my HDRI. So with the Z axis, so that's the one going up and down, of course, I can rotate it round, and you can see in the top viewport there, my HDRI rotating around, and I can make the scene look a little bit more interesting, maybe having a bit more light in the background like this. Looks quite stunning. Maybe a little bit further around away from the light, somewhere around there looks quite interesting. So my light's coming from somewhere over here. If you want to be able to see that, you can, in your 3D viewport, change to render, and we can see where the light's coming from, which is there, and therefore giving some shadows from the buildings on the left to the right. So pause the video here and have a go at rotating around your HDRI. Now if I change across to cycles, so in the render properties, across to cycles, and I'll change across to the GPU so it's faster and turn the denoise on for both the viewport and the render, so it renders much faster. We can see that the scene looks a lot more interesting now because of that realistic lighting that Cycles is giving us. So the sun's coming from over here, it's bouncing off these and offering a little bit of light here. Whereas Eevee, if I jump back to that, has way too much light in our scene and isn't faking it particularly well. So my recommendation would be to render in cycles. However, it does depend on the speed of your machine. You can set a time limit to each frame's render time. And if I change this to something like 3 seconds, I can then render out. And once it gets to 3 seconds, it will pause, then denoise the image, and it looks fairly reasonable. But I've got a very good graphics card, which renders very fast. So 3 seconds for my graphics card may produce a lot better renders than a lower grade one. I'll close this down, and the reason I would change it to 3 seconds is because we've now got 100 of these to render. So it will take us 300 seconds. So a few minutes. That's why setting a time limit is very useful. But for those that haven't got a powerful graphics card, you may want to change it back to Eevee, and you could try some modifications to increase the shadow intensity. One example would be to add in a sunlight of our own that we can control. So Shift-A to add, light, and then sun. Let's point it from the same direction the sun's coming from, so over here. So I'll come to top view, G to grab to move it towards that sun over there, and point it down towards my scene like this. Now under the lighting settings, I'll increase it a tiny bit to something like 3. So it's quite a powerful sun, and I'll come to our background and reduce the strength of our background. I'll just quickly check that the angle's okay, and reduce the background to 0 so I can see exactly how the sun's positioned, and bring it up and then point it down so we've got a bit more shadow in our scene like this, somewhere around there I think, and then bring the background up a little bit more, and we've got a bit more shadows being cast from these buildings here. I'll just bring the background up a touch more, so about 0.3 for the background and a sun value of 3 as well. We could also give this a little bit more yellow so it looks a little bit more like a sun, somewhere around there I think, and the scene's looking a little bit nicer. It's not ideal, and cycles is certainly a lot better, but it does give us that option. So your challenge then is to set up the lighting for your scene and decide whether you want to use Eevee or cycles. You might want to do a test in cycles to see how good the image looks with maybe a 3-second render. And if that takes too long, then you'll need to set up the lighting within Eevee and maybe put in an extra sun. Once you've done that, save your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll render out our final animation, and I'll talk a bit about rendering as a video file or rendering as still images. So here's where I got up to last time, and I'm back in the animation workspace. And rendering out animations is slightly different to still frames. It's always a good idea to do a test within Eevee, as it will render faster and you can see what your animation is going to look like, and then perhaps set a longer render in cycles. If I go across to the output properties, I can change the resolution to something like 50% for the sake of a test, so it should render nice and fast. It's a good idea to double check your frame range just here. My start is 1 and my end frame is 100. The most important section I would say is under the output settings. Now currently if I were to render my animation, that would be to go up to render and render animation, so Control F12 is the shortcut. It would send it to my temporary files. So make sure you've changed where it's going. Now I'm going to put it into a folder called Plane Animation Renders. So I'll double click on that, make sure I'm inside that folder and press accept. The reason I render it out to a folder is because the default for Blender and the best way to render is with still images. So you'll end up with 100 still images. I then bring them into an external program, such as Adobe Premiere in my case, to bring them all together. Now you can render it out as a movie file, so it's just one file. And I would suggest that if you don't have an external program that you want to use and you just want a video file. And it's perfectly fine to do that. There are slight advantages to still images, but I'll talk about those in a moment. So in order to render out as a movie file, we go to File Format. I'll click on the drop down there, and FFmpeg is going to be your best option. So I'll click on that, and under encoding, the current container is called Matroska, which is very good if you get a problem whilst rendering, but it's not recognized by all players. So you might want to change this to something like MPEG-4. For the quality, you'll probably want perceptually lossless, so you won't be able to see any loss in quality, but the file sizes won't be quite as big as lossless. And encoding speed, it's best to turn this to slowest because it doesn't actually take very long at all. You won't notice the difference, but you'll get the best encoding. So that's if you're rendering out as a video file. And now if I press Ctrl F12, you can see it going through very quickly through my frames because it's 50% for 1 and it's EV for 2. And at this point, if I want to play back my animation, I can find my file and play it. Or I can come up to the render settings and say View Animation. And you can see it playing there. So I'm happy that my animation is working and I'm comfortable with that. At this point, I would turn the resolution up to 100 and then go across the cycles and wait the 300 seconds for it to render completely. So that's rendering out with a video format. However, as I was saying, a preferred method for many people is to render out with still images. Most people, if I go across the file format, will go with the default, which is a PNG sequence. There's two advantages to this. One, you can have an alpha channel in the background. So if I go back to the render properties and go down to where it says film, I can actually set the background to transparent. And you can see I've now got a transparent background, so I could put in my own sky. And this is very good if you want to do some special effects and put an object into some real life footage. But I don't need to do that for the moment. So I'll untick that and go back to my render properties. So that's one advantage of a PNG, that it has this alpha channel and you can use that alpha channel to place in your own backgrounds. The other advantage is that if anything goes wrong, you'll have all the frames up to the point of the error that will be okay, and then you can just restart from that point. So with it set back to PNG, if I render now with Ctrl F12, you can see once again it goes through at the same pace, and I'll quickly speed this up for you. This time I have lots of single frames, as you can see here. So there's frame 1, and you can see I can go through my animation frame by frame. And like I was saying, I would send these across to a program such as Adobe Premiere to put them all into sequence. A free program such as DaVinci Resolve or even Movie Maker will do the same thing. If you don't want to use those programs, or you don't need the functionality of having an alpha channel in your file, then you may as well just render as a video file, as I talked about earlier, with the file format FFmpeg, and make the adjustments I talked about earlier. And to be fair, I find it very rare that I do get a crash, so you should be fine just rendering out as a video file from Blender. So pause the video here and render out your final animation. Of course, you can choose whether to use still images and put them all together in something like Adobe Premiere, or render them out as a movie file. Once you've done that, it would be great if you share your work with the community and take a look at how other people have got on as well. And of course, do remember to save your work. So hopefully you enjoyed that section and you feel a bit more confident when it comes to UV mapping. Again, don't panic if it doesn't look exactly like mine, but hopefully you're understanding how UVs work, and with a bit of practice you'll be able to create some fun, slightly more realistic looking items. Now to take this further, you could have some fun adding models to your scene, crates being the obvious one. Maybe adding some detail to the road, adding something like a pavement or sidewalk if you call it that. You could have more buildings and more variety there. Perhaps even start building some of the items such as the doors and windows, and then mapping those objects to the different areas of the image textures you've already got. Let's now jump to the next section where you'll be animating and rigging a character.